Fire and black smoke curled up from the burnt-out armored transport, staining the frontline sky a dirty red. Ethan crawled out of the wrecked troop compartment, his armor scorched and his visor flickering with errors. The sound of shelling faded away, leaving only the crackle of cooling metal in a suffocating, heavy silence. Every squadmate icon on Ethan's HUD was grayed out, leaving only his own signal blinking alone. Marcus's voice buzzed over the common channel, dry and cold as stone. Marcus ordered Ethan to evacuate the area immediately because an orbital bombardment run had already been approved. Ethan pulled up the 3D tactical map and saw the kill radius overlapping perfectly with his current position. He swore under his breath, tightened his grip on the plasma rifle, and started running along the shattered trench. Around Ethan, toppled mechs lay like dead giants. Manipulators snapped off, and human armor burned beyond recognition. A strange shadow at the edge of the shell crater ahead made Ethan freeze mid-step. Through the smoke, he saw a large humanoid body lying face down, its biometal armor spider-webbed with cracks. As Ethan moved closer, he realized it was a Varkari female warrior, about 2.5 meters tall, her powerful frame still tense even as she lay dying. Ethan's visor flashed a red tag. Soraya, Field Marshal, Varkari Command. Soraya's chest had been drilled through, and glowing purple energy blood leaked out in bright streams around the crater. Ethan's sensors spiked, showing an unstable biocore oscillating deep inside Soraya's ribcage. His suit's software fed him a chilling prediction. If Soraya died here, the blast from her body would erase the whole area before the orbital bombardment even arrived. Marcus's voice snapped over the radio, demanding to know why Ethan's signal was still stationary in the kill zone. Ethan replied that he had found a surviving Varkari commander with a self-destruct core on the verge of triggering. Marcus cut him off, ordering Ethan to abandon the target and prioritize survival above everything else. The battlefield rules Ethan had memorized were brutally clear. You did not waste resources to save a dying enemy combatant. He looked at Soraya again and saw that half of her faceplate had shattered, exposing pale gray skin and thin glowing tattoos tracing her cheekbone. Soraya's eyes snapped open, pupils dilating as they locked onto Ethan with a look that was equal parts feral and clouded by pain. She tried to lift her armored arm to reach for a weapon, but it only trembled before dropping uselessly back to the ground. Ethan felt the orbital strike countdown ticking in the corner of his HUD, every second stretching longer than the last. He drew a deep breath, dimmed his tactical overlay, and knelt beside Soraya's faintly glowing chest. Ethan clipped his exoframe tighter around his shoulders, yanked out the heavy field medkit, and started searching for a spot to anchor the stabilizer probes. Marcus was shouting in Ethan's earpiece, demanding confirmation that he was retreating and not doing something incredibly stupid. Ethan shut off the channel with a single tap, leaving a clean, perfect silence inside his helmet. He told Soraya quietly, not even sure she could hear him, that he wasn't going to leave anyone else to rot on this scrap heap. Ethan's fingers shook slightly as he set the stabilizer device against Soraya's chest, and somewhere deep down he knew that once he started, there would be no way back. The stabilizer in Ethan's hand vibrated softly, sending a white-blue glow rippling across the wound in Soraya's chest. On his HUD, Ethan watched Soraya's biocore instability drop from glaring red to blinking yellow, while her heart rate stayed in the critical band. Soraya's chest rose more deeply with each breath, a ragged rasp echoing through her cracked mask. Soraya's voice scraped out like metal on metal as she tried to speak, calling Ethan's name in a deep, unfamiliar rasp. Soraya told him he had temporarily shackled her self-destruct core, but unless he brought her to the cradle, they would both die with this place. Ethan asked what the hell the cradle was, his eyes flicking to the orbital strike timer ticking down on his HUD. Soraya said tersely that deep beneath this sector lay an ancient Varkari rebirth forge, used to rebuild the bodies of commanders like her. She explained that Forge had slept for centuries, waking only when it sensed a Varkari about to detonate along with half a front line. Ethan checked the strike clock and saw there were less than 15 minutes before the first orbital salvo hit. He pulled up the terrain map, plotting a route from their position to the underground coordinates Soraya indicated, a path clogged with craters and dead mechs. Ethan engaged the exoframe's power mode and clipped tow cables to anchor points on Soraya's armor to haul her tall body behind him. Micro thrusters at Ethan's heels roared as he leaned forward and dragged Soraya out of the crater, each step as heavy as towing a mech. Soraya tried to brace her hands against the ground to take some of the weight, but her armored arms skidded across the greasy gray dust. A stray artillery streak tore across the distant sky, reminding Ethan he was hauling a massive enemy general straight through a kill zone. A private channel opened with an unfamiliar female voice, sharper and colder than Marcus's. The caller introduced herself as Helena from Strategic Intelligence, saying they were watching his medical telemetry feed in real time. Helena coolly remarked that Ethan had accomplished something impressive by keeping an unstable Varkari commander's biocore under control. She requested that Ethan transmit the exact coordinates of any unusual subsurface structure he detected while moving. Helena added that if Ethan cooperated, she could delay the orbital bombardment window by a few minutes. As he dragged Soraya over a pile of dead mechs, Ethan answered vaguely that he was just trying to get the live bomb out of the kill radius. Helena gave a dry chuckle over the link, saying anything that could blow up half a division was something they very much wanted recovered intact. On the other side of the sky, aboard a Varkari warship, Orion felt a strange shiver run through his ritual bioarrays. Energy icons displayed a Varkari core on the verge of detonation, being slowed by some ancient structure beneath the surface. Orion recognized Soraya's bioprint mingled with a strange human trace, something that should not exist in any of their sacred doctrines. He ordered nearby units to converge around the cradle's location, with explicit instructions that humans were not to be allowed near that sacred place. On Ethan's HUD, friendly and enemy icons began popping up more densely, like two closing jaws around his path. Soraya pointed toward a dim line of dark stones ahead, telling Ethan the descent into the cradle lay behind the crack between two of those boulders. They reached the base of the ridge, where two upright slabs of black stone formed a narrow, pitch-dark cleft like a closing mouth. Soraya asked Ethan to help her stand, saying the door would not open without a Varkari hand on the sigil. Ethan poured all the exoframe's strength into pulling Soraya upright against the rock face, her head nearly brushing the cleft's upper edge. Soraya's armored hand pressed against a faint, glowing sigil on the stone, and the cleft shuddered softly as if taking a long breath. A line of light ran along the fissure, then the stone split into a damp, organic passageway, exhaling warm air like a breath. Ethan glanced back at his HUD and saw 6 minutes left on the strike clock, with clusters of unit icons from both sides closing in on his position. Helena cut back in on the channel, reminding Ethan her delay window was closing and demanding he transmit any anomalous coordinates immediately. Ethan said he'd detected a subsurface cavity a few hundred meters away and sent coordinates offset toward the mech graveyard. Helena was silent for a few seconds, then announced the bombardment would be postponed another 5 minutes so recon teams could check the new target. On the surface, human squads rushed toward the decoy coordinates while Varkari warriors dropped in nearby, turning the area into chaos well away from the fissure. Ethan didn't wait for Helena to reconsider. He helped Soraya into the organic tunnel, feeling as if they were stepping into the throat of some vast creature. As the doorway sealed behind them, battlefield noise was strangled, leaving only Ethan's heartbeat and a deep subterranean murmur. The tunnel walls around them were half metal, half flesh, with glowing veins of light running along them like living arteries. Every step Ethan took made the soft floor sink under his boots and spring back. sending a shiver up his spine. Soraya said this was only the upper level of the cradle, and that the true heart lay further below, where Ethan's sensors would start screaming about an energy storm.
We do not know what lies ahead.
Ethan watched the radiation and energy levels creeping up on his wrist display, feeling like he was descending into the radioactive heart of an alien god. She warned Ethan that once they stepped into the cradle's central chamber, every choice would lock, and both of them would be bound to it until the end. At the end of the passage, a wash of white-blue light hit his eyes, and Ethan paused for a beat, staring toward the opening as if looking into a volcano's mouth. Ethan glanced back at the dark corridor behind them, where the entrance had sealed, then drew a deep breath and stepped forward into the radiance with Soraya. The white-blue light in the central chamber poured out like waves, forcing Ethan to squint as he stepped over the threshold. As his vision cleared, he realized he was standing in a vast, domed space, its ceiling a lattice of glowing conduits like an enormous nervous system. In the center of the chamber sat a cocoon-like structure, half metal and half flesh, pulsing gently to an invisible heartbeat. The floor beneath Ethan's boots was etched with concentric Varkari sigils, each ring glowing faintly as he stepped forward. Soraya leaned on him, each of her movements making the symbols flare brighter, as if the cradle were recognizing its owner. Ethan heard the tunnel door behind them seal shut with a heavy boom that made his chest vibrate. On his HUD, his topside link icon turned gray, signaling that contact with the surface had been severed. Soraya told Ethan to shut down his internal comms entirely, because once the cradle activated, every radio signal would be swallowed.
Cut your comms.
Ethan killed his mic, feeling as though he had just cut his last thread to anyone but her. Soraya motioned for Ethan to climb the steps toward the cocoon, where the floor dipped into two opposing standing spots. Ethan realized the two spots were carved with different sigil sets, one clearly matching Varkari physiology, and the other more ambiguous. Soraya said that centuries ago, the second position had been reserved for a Varkari battle partner, but today, it would have to accept a human. Ethan asked if this was just some kind of giant medical device, trying to keep his voice steady. Soraya answered that the cradle did not merely heal, but was where her ancestors performed their mating and rebirth rites for warrior bloodlines. She explained plainly that when two beings stepped inside, the cradle would read both of their genes, mix them, and reconstruct their bodies on a new template. Ethan swallowed hard at the phrase, "mix their genes," picturing the dark experiments he'd been warned about in training. Soraya met Ethan's eyes and added that the rite could also seed a new life if the two bloodlines proved compatible. Ethan felt the air in the chamber grow suddenly thick, as if the cradle itself were waiting for his answer. He asked if there was any other way to keep Soraya's core from detonating without stepping in there with her. Soraya shook her head, saying her core had linked to the cradle the moment he triggered the stabilizer, and now either they both went in, or everything blew. She reminded Ethan that if her core ruptured here, the entire sublevel, the ground above, and every unit fighting there would be erased. Ethan looked down at the two standing spots, imagining the door closing once he stepped in, and knowing he would never be the same afterward. He asked whether the rite bound them mentally as well, or if it was just a cold biomedical procedure. Soraya explained that for the Varkari, two warriors who entered the cradle together were bound more deeply than marriage because their minds would touch forever. Ethan heard his heart pounding in his chest, from fear and from the realization that he was standing before a choice that wasn't just about him. He thought of Marcus, of Helena, of the squad mates whose icons had gone dark on his HUD, and of the fallen Varkari warriors scattered above. Soraya said softly that if Ethan refused, she would still walk in alone, but then the cradle might tear her apart and explode at any moment. Ethan flicked open the minimap in his HUD and saw units from both sides still clashing around the decoy coordinates he had sent. He understood that in a few more minutes, Helena would realize she'd been misdirected, and then nothing would shield this place. Ethan asked if the cradle did create a new life, whether Soraya was sure they could control it, or if it would just become another terrible weapon. Soraya answered that her ancestors believed the cradle forged bridges stronger than the old generation, but that no one had ever tried it with another species. Ethan let out a dry, involuntary laugh, saying that if there was a training manual for this situation, he must have skipped that page. Soraya didn't laugh, but her eyes softened slightly, as if she appreciated that he could still joke at a time like this. At last, Ethan stepped onto his designated spot, feeling the sigils beneath his boots grow warm as they recognized human genes. Soraya stepped into her circle, her tall frame facing him, and the entire cradle seemed to hold its breath in that moment. Lines of light rose from the floor, curling around their ankles, calves, and waists like roots, tethering them to the cocoon at the chamber's center. Ethan felt his armor systems shut down piece by piece, weapons going cold until all that was left was his own body heat and Soraya's overwhelming presence before him. Soraya extended her hand, palm open, and said the rite would begin when the two of them touched under the cradle's gaze. Ethan looked at that hand, remembered dragging her across the battlefield, and then placed his own against it, feeling the armor beneath her skin thrum like a second heartbeat. As their hands locked, the cocoon in the center unfurled into an empty chamber, and a shaft of light poured down from the ceiling to engulf them. Ethan had just enough time to think, no turning back, before the floor vanished beneath him, and his body was lifted into the cradle's hollow. Light swallowed everything, stretching his body into blurry lines as his awareness was drawn into a sea of unfamiliar memories. Ethan saw himself on another battlefield under a purple sky, looking through Soraya's eyes as she led Varkari troops charging human lines. He felt the fury, the fear, and the strange respect Soraya held for those who dared stand firm against her power. And somewhere deep within the light, he sensed Soraya watching his own grueling training days, the simulations that forced him to choose who lived and who died. The two streams of memory collided, dissolved, and blended as the cradle read every fragment of their genes and began deciding what hybrid could be born from them. Just before everything sank into darkness, Ethan felt a tiny spark between them tremble, like the very first heartbeat sounding in the void. Ethan woke in a warm, dense darkness, his own heartbeat booming as if amplified through a resonance chamber. As a dim light seeped in, he realized he was lying on a soft, organic surface, like giant skin that had just knitted after a wound. Ethan jerked upright, battlefield instincts making his hand reach for a gun before he remembered the cradle had stripped away his armor and weapons. A voice sounded directly in his mind, rough but clear, speaking his name in a way he'd never heard from any human. Ethan.
Ethan.
Ethan turned and saw Soraya a few steps away, sitting with her back against the chamber wall, her 2.5-meter frame bathed in white-blue light. Soraya's armor had been completely rebuilt, the cracks gone, replaced by a smooth surface like living metal scales. Ethan realized he still wore human armor, but patches of its surface had changed, sprouting glowing lines that mirrored the cradle's patterns. He touched his helmet, and the HUD sprang to life, but the interface was no longer Alliance standard. It was a hybrid of human and Varkari design. As Ethan tried to marshal his thoughts, a wash of emotions not his own flooded in. Relief, exhaustion, tinged with a gentle surprise. He turned to Soraya and realized he wasn't just hearing her voice in his head. He could feel her heartbeat, her breathing, and the dull ache in her muscles. At the same moment, the same astonishment flashed in Soraya's eyes, as if she too was tasting the sensations of the smaller body beside her. So, it's linked, Soraya said, this time aloud. But Ethan felt the words form in his mind before the sound reached his ears. Ethan tried silently thinking a short curse, and Soraya's face twitched before she let out a brief laugh. "I heard that," she said, her gaze scolding yet amused, and Ethan felt that amusement spill into him like contagious laughter. Ethan flexed his hand and found his reflexes sharper, muscles responding smoothly, as if he'd just been given a software upgrade. From Soraya's side, Ethan felt her strength restored almost fully, but also a thin thread of worry trailing through her thoughts. He was about to ask what she feared when the entire cradle trembled, as if something had just slammed into the ceiling above. Ethan checked his HUD and saw seismic indicators marking small explosions just outside the rock shell encasing the cradle. Through the link, he sensed familiar flares of human anger and other, deeper flares from Varkari warriors closing in. Soraya closed her eyes and pressed her hand to the chamber wall, and Ethan saw their surroundings appear in her mind as a map of living sensations. They both realized the ring on the surface was tightening, and their only advantage was that no one up there knew what had just happened inside the cradle. Ethan turned back to Soraya just in time to see her frown, her free hand drifting to her lower abdomen as if something felt wrong. A strange wave of dizziness surged through the link, not entirely Ethan's, not entirely Soraya's, but belonging to something smaller between them. Ethan felt a heartbeat, faint but unmistakable, somewhere in their shared field, like a new low note added to the harmony between him and Soraya. At the same moment, Soraya's abdomen twitched, and in Ethan's mind, a rough image flashed, a tiny point of light suspended in warm darkness. Soraya's eyes flew open and met Ethan's, and he knew she had seen the same image even though neither of them had spoken a word. "That's impossible," Ethan whispered, but the trembling in their bond itself answered otherwise. Soraya laid both hands on her stomach, closed her eyes, and Ethan felt her probe her own body in a way no human ever could. A clearer image formed in both of their minds, a tiny cellular structure twisted from two distinct gene strands woven together by the cradle. Soraya whispered through the link that the cradle had deemed them a valid pair and automatically triggered its preservation program, seeding new life. At the same time, the cocoon's systems flared once more, then dimmed, as if the cradle had finished its work and was slipping back into a long sleep. Ethan managed to choke out, "You mean, in there, is a hybrid child of human and Varkari?"
You're pregnant.
Soraya opened her eyes, looked down at her belly, then back at him, and they both felt that tiny heartbeat thrum, as if in reply. For an instant, Ethan saw a hazy future image in his mind, a child standing between two rows of flags, bearing the eyes of both their species. He couldn't tell if that image came from him, from her, or from the new life itself, but it vanished as quickly as it arrived. A louder blast shook the chamber ceiling, dust sifting down, yanking them back to reality. The two of them, and now three, were trapped in a living tomb under siege. Ethan pulled up the geological map again, seeing new fractures appearing, signaling that both sides were unknowingly drilling their way toward the cradle. Soraya said aloud, and in thought that if they were discovered, neither side would let this child exist as a person. It would only be asset or threat. Ethan felt her searing fear wash into him, mixed with the razor-sharp resolve of a warrior defending her territory. In response, deep within the link, that tiny spark suddenly pulsed stronger, sending goosebumps across Ethan's skin. The glowing veins on the chamber walls flared in unison and then softened, as if the cradle had just acknowledged a third entity in its system. Ethan said they couldn't stay here to be dug up like relics, especially with a life already a political target before it even had a name. Soraya nodded, saying the cradle had done its part, the rest was on them, and they had to leave before both sides realized what hell had just been opened. The organic door to the upper hallway peeled open again with a wet hiss, inviting yet menacing like a creature's mouth ready to release its prey. Ethan tightened his grip on the plasma rifle he found had been modified by the cradle, Varkari-style circuits running along its body, and merging with his armor's lines. Soraya rose fully, towering over Ethan, but this time he didn't feel small before her, more like he was standing beside an extension of himself. Before stepping into the hallway, Ethan glanced at Soraya's belly and said that perhaps that little spark should have a name, so all three of them wouldn't forget what they were fighting for. Soraya was silent for a long moment, then whispered an ancient Varkari name in his mind. Kalan, the word for those born to be a bridge. As that name echoed through the link, they both felt the tiny heart respond with a joyous beat, as if it had just been acknowledged. Ethan nodded and murmured, "All right, Kalan. Then for now, our family is getting out of this grave first." Soraya tightened her grip around her energy weapon, her other hand still on her belly, then stepped into the upward tunnel with the gait of both a general and a mother. Ethan followed close behind, feeling their footsteps, their heartbeats, and that third, smaller heartbeat all blending into a single rhythm pounding in his chest. The organic tunnel sloped upward until Ethan could feel the distant tremors of shellfire above them, like strangled thunder. Soraya walked right behind him, each of her steps making the tunnel walls shiver, one hand still on her belly as if to reassure Kalan. Ethan felt that tiny heartbeat blending into theirs, no longer wavering like when they first woke, but strangely calm. Kalan is suspiciously quiet, Ethan thought, and felt a faint mischievous flicker ripple through the link in reply. At the end of the tunnel, a sliver of natural light appeared, and Ethan realized they were about to reach the surface. Ethan motioned for Soraya to halt, then quickly crouched at the mouth of the exit to edge his helmet camera out first. On his HUD, the surface view appeared, a low rock fissure tucked behind a strip of charred mech wreckage, momentarily hidden from both sides' main lines of sight. Ethan slipped out first, worming through the rocks, then turned to signal Soraya to wait until he was clear so she wouldn't expose too much of herself at once. When Soraya stepped out of the crack, she had to duck to fit, and for a moment, her 2.5-meter form stood stark against the gray sky. Ethan immediately tugged her down behind a collapsed mech plate, heart pounding as he realized a single recon drone would expose them instantly. He opened the radar and saw human markers moving toward the decoy coordinates, while Varkari dots began converging from the opposite side. "Our safe window is closing," Ethan sent to Soraya, along with an image of the tightening ring on his map. Soraya replied with an image of a retreat path stretching toward an abandoned Alliance bunker in the distance, where the rock cover would shelter Kalan better. Ethan nodded, then crawled over the mech carcasses, signaling for Soraya to skirt along the far side to reduce the chance of both being tagged at once. They had barely separated by a few meters when a human spherical recon drone suddenly rose from behind a metal slab, its sensor light flipping to red. Ethan raised his rifle by reflex, but before he could pull the trigger, the drone's sensors flickered wildly and then went dark, as if someone had yanked its plug. An irregular thump from Kalan echoed into Ethan's mind, along with the sense of the drone as an empty toy someone had just crushed. Soraya glanced at him, and Ethan knew she'd felt it too. Kalan had just touched the drone's systems. "Nice work, kid," Ethan thought, and a faint, smug ripple in the link made him unsure whether to laugh or worry. Shouts and gunfire roared from the decoy position where humans and Varkari had collided, but radar icons showed small teams peeling off to sweep the surroundings. A 4-man human recon team appeared at the edge of a visual range, crossing between two charred mechs, led by a lieutenant with a scanning monocle. Ethan pulled Soraya lower and whispered in her mind that if he had to choose between killing his own people and protecting Kalan, he would not hesitate. Soraya did not argue. The link carried only a cold wave of a general's approval and a gentle tightening around the life in her womb. The human recon team swept their scanner, and Ethan watched the sensor beam sweep right over the metal slab, sheltering them. The moment the scan line touched Ethan's armor, Kalan pulsed again, and the lieutenant's display abruptly turned into white noise. "Is this thing hacked?" the lieutenant swore, smacking the screen, while Ethan saw in his mind a flash of Callan doodling spirals across the data. Before the recon team could try again, a volley of Varkari green energy bolts slashed across the gap, forcing them to dive behind another mech carcass. Ethan peeked through a gap and saw a Varkari squad closing from the other side, led by a warrior in the ritual colors of Orion. In the link, Orion's voice echoed faintly from afar, not speaking to them directly, but ordering his troops to retrieve Soraya at any cost. Soraya clenched her jaw, her eyes darkening as she realized that to the Varkari, she was now just a dangerous object to be contained. From the human side, Helena's voice came over an encrypted channel. All units to prioritize tagging the hybrid target if they spotted an unusually tall Varkari accompanied by a human soldier. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine as he realized Helena hadn't said rescue, but secure and quarantine the target. Neither side sees Callan as a person, Ethan sent to Soraya, along with a simmering anger flaring like live coals. Soraya answered with a brief image, herself standing between rows of both species, weapon in hand, Callan behind her, and anyone stepping forward, dropping dead. A stray energy round streaked past, slammed into the mech plate by Ethan's head, and exploded, blasting dust and shrapnel over both of them. Ethan reflexively lunged out, firing back toward the green bolts, and his mind snapped into a tactical sharpness like a blade. He realized that edge wasn't entirely his. Soraya was lending him her battlefield instincts through the link. They moved almost in sync. Ethan laid down, suppressing fire, while Soraya used her tall frame as a shield, leaping from cover to cover and always angling her belly inward to keep it protected. Callan suddenly pushed a wave of sensation along the link, warning of a Varkari squad flanking on the right before the radar even updated. Thanks to that warning, Ethan lobbed an energy grenade into the choke point in time, forcing the entire squad to hit the dirt instead of sealing their escape. The firefight drew more guns. Within seconds, both humans and Varkari realized there was an unusual pocket of resistance in the mech graveyard. Ethan's radio suddenly flooded with voices calling his name, Marcus barking orders, and Helena demanding live visuals of the target. At the same time, from the Varkari side, Orion's command voice echoed in Soraya's mind, urging her to surrender to preserve the legacy of the clan. Callan seemed to have had enough of the noise. Suddenly, all of Ethan's channels fused into one, Marcus and Helena's voices merging into a single flowing stream of sound. More frighteningly, for a brief beat, Ethan heard the muttering of a Varkari soldier cursing outside, even though he hadn't opened their channel. Soraya startled as with a blink, she heard a human sergeant relaying coordinates to Helena in perfect Alliance standard, even though she wore none of their gear. Callan is linking the networks, Ethan said, both to Soraya and to himself, as he began to grasp that their child was affecting not just machines, but entire comm systems. For a few seconds, commanders on both sides heard the gunfire, shouting and swearing of the enemy, as if everyone had been thrown into one chaotic conference call. Helena's voice suddenly snapped, ordering technicians to cut all channels. But just then, Ethan realized this was his one chance to make everyone listen. He traded a quick look with Soraya, and with a single shared thought, they stopped fighting the noise and let Callan amplify their signal instead. Ethan opened a broadcast-wide channel, feeling his chest become a loudspeaker, and shouted, "All human and Varkari units, listen carefully." His voice rang out not only over radios, but directly in many minds, accompanied by warped images of himself and Soraya, standing amid the mech corpses. "If you keep firing, the cradle beneath us will be awakened again," Ethan said, showing them a flash of the cocoon cracking open. Soraya added her voice, deep and resonant, saying that if her core was pushed past its threshold again, not just this sector, but ships in orbit might be dragged into the blast. Callan underlined their words with a heavy pulse that blanked many officers' screens before restoring them, like a slap delivered through the systems. "Choose," Ethan said, his voice strangely calm amid the gunfire. "Keep shooting and be buried under this rock with us, or stop and hear us out." Soraya rose to her full height out of cover, her weapon lowered but posture ready, one hand resting on her belly as a reminder of what they were defending. Around them, the gunfire slowly dwindled and then ceased altogether for a few rare seconds of silence, leaving only the wind and the 3 heartbeats echoing in the link. In that fragile pause, Ethan knew the next chapter would be written by the words they were about to speak, and that any gunshot now could be the last for far too many worlds. In the distance, an autocannon kept sweeping its barrel, as if it hadn't yet received the order to cease fire. Ethan and Soraya simultaneously felt Callan tighten the link, like an invisible hand holding the whole battlefield's breath. Through the chaotic shared channel, Marcus's voice broke in first, fury and fear mixed as he demanded Ethan confirm he was alive and not insane. Ethan answered curtly that he was perfectly sane, and that if Marcus wanted everyone to live, he should have all his units lower their weapons immediately. From the Varkari side, Orion pushed in with a thought that boomed like war drums, asking Soraya if she was letting the humans control her. Soraya replied with an image of Callan lighting up the darkness between 2 worlds, then said she no longer served Orion, but only protected her family. Those words echoed as her voice in the minds of dozens of Varkari warriors, making entire rank lines outside freeze mid-step. On Ethan's HUD, he saw weapon markers slowly tilt down and predictive fire lines blur and disappear. Helena broke the next silence, her voice unusually low as she asked if Ethan understood he'd just created a planet-level diplomatic incident. Ethan replied that he understood perfectly, because at their feet sat a device that could erase the entire front and a few orbital ships if things went wrong. He proposed that both sides immediately establish a 1-kilometer ceasefire bubble around their position until high-level representatives could arrive. Callan underlined that proposal with a gentle pressure wave through local nav systems, sketching a glowing ring around their coordinates on countless maps at once. Marcus swore once, then grudgingly agreed, ordering Alliance troops to pull back behind the marked safety line. After a few hesitant beats, Orion also ordered the Varkari warriors to halt, adding that no one was to fire on the unstable core without direct orders. The battlefield seemed to exhale, literally. Dust and smoke drifted apart. Explosions receded, leaving only cooling metal and wind whining through mech skeletons. Ethan lowered his rifle, laid a hand lightly on Soraya's armored arm, feeling their shared tremor and Callan's steady, defiant pulse between them. Now we're the eye of the storm, he thought, and Soraya gave a faint smile, saying the eye was the safest place if you knew how to stay centered. An Alliance dropship and a Varkari lander began descending on opposite edges of the safe ring, their engines roaring like 2 predators forced to lie side by side. In the open ground at the circle's center, Ethan and Soraya waited. Dozens of sights from both sides locked on them, but no bullet allowed to leave the barrel. Helena was the first to step out of the dropship, her armor irritatingly pristine against the burned mud, followed by 2 escort soldiers wound tight as bowstrings. On the opposite side, an energy ramp unfolded for Orion to emerge, his ceremonial cloak trailing a dark streak over the scorched metal. As the 2 approached, Callan automatically damped the battlefield noise in the link, letting Ethan and Soraya hear every heartbeat of those walking into the circle. Helena stopped a few meters away, removing her helmet to reveal sweat-slick hair and cold eyes, raking Soraya up and down as if assessing a new weapon. Orion halted opposite Helena, blade-sharp gaze sliding from Soraya to Ethan before he inclined his head in an old Varkari greeting. "How strange," Helena spoke first. "The first time I've had to negotiate with both an enemy general and my own soldier over the same asset." Ethan corrected instantly. "Not an asset, a person. 3 persons." Orion nodded slightly, adding that to the Varkari. The bearer of life was always sacred, regardless of which genes they carried. The words didn't reassure Helena, but in the link, Ethan felt Callan answer with a warm thump, as if marking the first protective claim from an outsider. The negotiations began like an interrogation. Helena wanted to know exactly what the cradle had done to Ethan's body and mind. Orion, in contrast, asked Soraya what ancestral bindings the rite had laid on her, and whether their warrior bloodline had been diluted. Each of their questions made Callan stir the link, sending pricks of discomfort, like an unborn child, frowning. Finally, Ethan cut in, proposing that both commanders test something before they spoke further of control, weapons, or legacy. He asked Callan to extend the bridge just enough for Helena and Orion to hear each other's voices in their heads, without being able to influence each other. For a moment, Helena's eyes bulged as she heard Orion swearing in Varkari directly in her mind. Orion was just as startled to understand every clipped English word Helena thought in reply. That raw confusion, unfiltered by translators, silenced them both, as if all their slogans had been yanked away at once. "This is only a very small part of what Callan can do," Soraya said, her voice low and firm, hand still on her belly. She reminded them that this child had just touched weapons, communications, and even the awareness of hundreds of people, just to produce a few seconds of silence. "If you turn it into a tool," she concluded, "one day it will shatter every chain you put on it, and drag many other things down with them." Ethan added that if, instead, they let Callan grow as a person, the bridges it built could be stronger than any fleet or ritual. Helena studied Ethan for a long time, weighing whether he was naive or a strategist seeing further ahead than she did. Orion looked at Soraya with eyes equal parts hurt and proud, accepting that his general had stepped beyond anything the old doctrines had dared write. After a while, Helena offered an escape route, a neutral research medical station in orbit, where both Alliance and Varkari held oversight, but neither had full ownership. Orion added a condition. Callan had to be recognized under Varkari law as a rights-bearing individual, not a military asset. Helena reluctantly agreed, in return demanding that Ethan officially serve as the Alliance's special liaison on the station, with authority to refuse any order that directly endangered Callan. Soraya said she would hold the title of Varkari Briar representative at the same station, but above all, she and Ethan would be the final arbiters of all decisions concerning the child. Callan answered with a steady, strong beat that rippled through the link into Helena and Orion as well, making them both unconsciously touch their own chests, as if to check their hearts. The provisional agreement was recorded in 3 layers: military documents, warrior ritual, and a silent vow ringing in the minds of 4 adults and 1 unborn life. Months later, on the neutral station hanging between 2 fleets, Ethan stood at a wide window gazing down at the planet that had been Callan's first battleground. Beside him, Soraya, still nearly a head taller, held a blanket-wrapped infant whose skin was a pale coppery violet and whose eyes were a strange mix of brown and gray. Callan clutched at his mother's armor, staring out at space in quiet curiosity, and in the link Ethan sensed a river of signals, thoughts, and voices running wild, yet reined in. Behind the glass, in the observation room, Helena and Orion stood an awkward distance apart, each leaning on a separate rail, but neither taking their eyes off the child. Callan turned his head toward them, and for a heartbeat, both heard the same simple question in their minds, free of command or doctrine. "What will you teach me first?" Helena answered in thought that she would teach Callan how to protect himself from those who would turn him into a tool. Orion replied that he would teach him to listen to his own heartbeat before any oath of war or peace. Ethan and Soraya both smiled as they felt those answers, and Callan gave a tiny laugh, bare gums flashing in the station lights. In the link, 3 heartbeats, a human, a towering Varkari over 2 meters tall, and a hybrid child, blended with the distant rumble of the 2 fleets, a reminder that from one reckless decision in the cradle, a new chapter for both civilizations had truly begun.